Today is March 23rd, 2022, and my guest is Dwayne Betts. His first appearance on EconTalk was October 2020, when he talked about reading, his time in prison, his poetry collection entitled Felon, and his project, which is now called Freedom Reads, which has the goal of placing a curated 500-book collection in prison housing units so that curious prisoners can have access to books. And since he was here the first time, he has won a MacArthur grant, and although we don't want to believe that correlation is causation, you never know. Could be true.
Could be.
After EconTalk, everything turned around for Dwayne. Just kidding, but I am thrilled about that project, Freedom Reads. And if you have not looked into it, we'll of course have a link to the website. I just want to warn parents listening with young children, there will be topics and conversation in this conversation that might not be appropriate for young children. So you may want to listen in advance. Dwayne, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's a true pleasure. I'm really happy to be here. And it is funny because the sort of rub against economists is that they don't read books like literature. and you're consistently proven that not to be the sort of norm. So I'm excited to be here to talk about Primo Levi and Ralph Ellison.
Yeah, well, the idea behind this conversation is a little bit crazy. I encouraged Dwayne to read two books by Primo Levi that I had read a long time ago, at least one of them, the first one, and that is a book called If This Is a Man, which is his memoir of being in Auschwitz. And about a decade plus after he wrote that first book, he wrote a sequel, sort of what happened after he was released from Auschwitz called The Truce. I'll mention in passing, they have different titles sometimes in America. The first, If This Is a Man, is also called in America Survival in Auschwitz. And The Truce, I think, is sometimes called in America The Awakening. Those are both horrible titles. Primo Levi's original titles are much better. We'll probably talk about that. Anyway, so Dwayne read those, and I thought it'd be interesting if they're about the Jewish experience to some extent. So I thought it'd be interesting for me to read something from the Black experience, and then we would share our thoughts on that. And Dwayne suggested Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which I had read 40 or 50 years ago, remembered very little of it. I particularly forgot it was 582 pages long. I might have made some kind of protest, Dwayne, but I'm really glad I read it. It's an extraordinary book. I think easily, arguably, the great American novel. And I didn't appreciate it when I was 20 years old. And so I'm very glad I read it again. Let's start, Dwayne, why don't you say something about Ralph Ellison?
Ralph Ellison is almost like the patron saint of missed deadlines. Because, and I'll talk about Invisible Man in a second, but he's the kind of person who put a lot of pressure on himself to write the first book. From Oklahoma, was a musician, but was just like a deeply curious individual. And he moves to New York to become a writer, and he builds these relationships with Langston Hughes, with Richard Wright, a series of deeply, deeply fascinating letters with Richard Wright, which arguably helped me understand better some of the parts of Invisible Man that made me cringe on the first read and the second read. But he would work on Invisible Man for years and years and years. And when it was finally released, interestingly enough, the prologue and the epilogue were written last, so it wasn't this notion of like he knew where he was going from the beginning. It's almost like an improvisational jazz riff. And I always thought about it as a coming of age story, but it might be better considered a picaresque than a coming of age story. And I stole that from somebody, but I think it might be better considered a picaresque because it is like sort of this his work trying to understand what it means to be American. And after that, he excelled as an essayist. He wrote Shadow and Act and Going to the Territory. And his second novel, Juneteenth, was never completed. But famously, as he was working on it and delayed, it was like the whole manuscript burned in the fire. And when he passed, he had 2,000 pages that sort of got coupled together into two different books. One was Juneteenth, and one was like 3 days before the shooting. And I think actually it's Invisible Man becomes the rare single book that I do think stands the test of time. And reading it this time, I recognize that it says things to me that I didn't notice the first time I read it, but also that I haven't necessarily heard other people say, which is like deeply fascinating, that I could find something in a book that not only did I not notice, but in listening to podcasts and reading reviews, like I hadn't noticed other people noticing.
Yeah, a picaresque, I think, is a series of adventures that a character goes on, like almost a travelogue. It's a very peculiar book. It's not a normal novel at all. The character's personality is not, quote, normal. We get deep, deep access to some of his inner thoughts, and he decides not to share a bunch of others. Let me say a little bit about Primo Levi. And I think the cocktail party word for a coming of age book is a Bildungsroman.
Yeah, I couldn't pronounce it.
Yeah, well, neither can I. So that's my shot. But anyway, it could be handy like a crossword puzzle. I don't know. Primo Levi was a chemist. He's Italian. He's deported to Auschwitz late in the war, I think 43, 44, around 43, 44. He spends, I think, 11 months in the camp, survives, is as part of the liberation of the camp when the Russians come. And it's a searingly, if this is a man, is a searingly unemotional look at the human beings thrust together in the camp. It's really a powerful book. And then The Truce is about how he gets home back to Italy from Auschwitz, which you'd think would take about a week, maybe, or a few days, but instead I think it takes 9 months. It's a harrowing, heartbreaking book, also very funny in parts. As an economist, I'm fascinated by the relentless amount of bargaining and barter that takes place in that book. There are a number of characters in that book who just like to make a deal, and they're just going to argue with somebody about they'll sell a shoelace or a chicken wing. I mean, it's an unbelievable book as a illustration of Adam Smith's line about man's propensity to truck barter and exchange. But ultimately, I found it in many ways, it's almost as sad as the first volume, which is hard to do. Primo Levi gets home. He eventually writes a number of books. The most well-known after these two is the one called The Periodic Table, drawing on his chemistry experience, and it's also a different kind of memoir. It's a wonderful book. I really like it. And he dies in 1987, having fallen down a stairwell in a death that is ruled a suicide. And we'll probably talk about that at some point. There's quite a bit of evidence that it wasn't a suicide. But I just want to mention before we start that I think a lot of people have an emotional stake in it either being a suicide or not a suicide, as if somehow people argue that, he let us down. He survived Auschwitz, but then he killed himself. And the Nazis got the final victory, some people will say. And I find that so horrifying and so disrespectful. But I just want to mention that there was a wonderful article by Diego Gambetta in the Boston Review looking at the evidence that it was not a suicide. And readers can check that out for themselves. But the truth is, it's not important in many ways. Primo Levi is immortal, and these two books make him immortal. So,
I should say one more thing about Ellison that I think just listening to you talk about Primo Levi reminds me of. It's easy to forget that he's a chemist. It's easy to sort of forget the alchemy that happens to transform a chemist into a poet. And I was thinking about this essay that Ellison wrote. It's called "The Little Man at Cheehaw Station," and essentially what happens is at the time Ellison is working like delivering papers or something, and he goes to knock on a door, and he hears voices, and the men inside are talking about opera, and not just talking about opera in a way a novice would, but they're like deeply debating things that different people do within the art and contemporary singers and performers. And so he doesn't knock; he's just listening. And then when he finally goes to knock, he falls in, and the door's open, and there's all of these black men in it with a soot all over their faces, and he's astonished because he's thinking, "This is not who I would have expected to have that conversation." And the essay becomes this corrective on how to on like a lesson on not to confuse who we think will have knowledge, and always remember that it's this group of people who are deeply invested in something that you care about, that you can't predict and you can't name. And that was my response to reading Primo Levi's book, because honestly, I got this like strange relationship to books in general and philosophy, and that it would, I'd be the kid that talked too much, and the teacher would say, see me reading, and I would ask a teacher. I had this long standing habit of asking strangers what they're reading. And I asked my 10th grade history teacher, what was he reading? It was a Jewish cat, and I wouldn't have even known what that meant back then. And I only knew him a little later because I asked him. It was a philosophy book. He let me read it. And then later on, he was trying to organize a field trip to the Holocaust Museum, and the school wouldn't let him. And so he asked a bunch of the students if we really wanted to go, we could go in the summer. And so he took us in the summer, and that was my first experience at the Holocaust Museum. I had this teacher. I was in 10th grade. It was summer 10th grade. So it's the summer before I went to prison. He took us to the Holocaust Museum, and it was, I'm not going to act like it was like deeply moving and sort of transformative, but it was like, damn, human beings do this to each other. And it was deeply unsettling. And actually I was too young to have the information to process it in a lot of real ways. And I couldn't, and I clearly wasn't able to connect what I learned and what I saw to what I might do myself on a much, lower level, but still the kind of brutality in which we treat our fellow people. And so returning to Primo Levi was a bit of a blessing, because it helped me think about how do you write your way through hardship. And it helped me, the struggle of every memoir, I think, is that how do you not be the hero of your own story? And this was a stunning description of a story in which the writer almost effortlessly like resisted being the hero of the tale.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm really glad you mentioned that first part about the inhumanity of human beings at times, and very early in Invisible Man. And I've been encouraging listeners to read both books, all three books, before we start talking about it. You still, please, if you want, put this on pause. We want to be able to talk about some of the plot and what happens in both books. And you should read it yourself before you hear us. But then the early part of Invisible Man is the scene, Battle Royale that Ellison finds himself as a young boy in a public fight for entertainment in front of a bunch of rich white people. And it is one of the most heartbreaking passages. Again, it's a work of fiction, but it doesn't matter. It's like, how could people do this to other people? How could they manipulate them with such cruelty? And there's no answer to that question, unfortunately, but it happens.
Did you think the beginning is interesting, though? Because the first couple pages when he says, this is the part that struck me when I reread it. He says, I am an invisible man. No, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasms. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When I read it, and the whole book is ostensibly about race in America.
Yeah.
But he said people refuse to see me. he did not say white people refuse to see
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And I think on the second read, what I found most stunning is that the invisibility is not just a product of race. And I think his larger argument was like the invisibility was a product of the denial of the agency of an individual. And so even in that battle royal, was on the second read, what was fascinating is that the nameless protagonist and everybody that's fighting knows how absurd it is, but they each feel invested in playing their role. And their role shifts in different ways. Like their role includes coordinating with each other. Their role includes picking collaborators. The unnamed narrator, the protagonist, he tries to flip one of the white men onto the electrified coins at one point, and then gets kicked in the face for doing it. So it is like this little sliver of resistance, and that protagonist wants to give his speech. And that
Oh,
was
yeah.
what I found so sad, is that, like, he was like, I still need to get a speech. And then it was sort of like, even in giving a speech, it was that moment where he said social equality. And he was like, "What'd you say?" I said social responsibility. And it was that moment where the assertion of what it means to be like human, and it comes out even in the sort of desperate times, which was like, ultimately, I believe that's what I appreciated about If This Is a Man. And it was also said, if this is a man, this is how a man behaves. If this is a man, right, as opposed to this is not a man. And I think the unnamed protagonist is also asking this question: is like, how do you move through the world if you are a man, and particularly if you are unformed and you're trying to come to some sense of what the world is, how do you respond? And it's a deeply moral question, I think, that gets asked and answered in different ways throughout both books.
Yeah. Um, it's interesting. Both of them, both the narrators, Levi and Ellison, are hiding in different ways within their book. Levi keeps a lot of things away from us. He's, as you say, he's not the hero, and he reveals things that are shameful that he's done in the book. But you have the feeling that there's some limit to how much he can reveal about himself. There's that. I just don't want to miss this scene. There's a scene where he gets this incredibly great bit of good fortune. He gets to work in a lab because he knows a tiny amount of, not tiny, but he knows some chemistry relative to the project. And he and a number of the prisoners who, it's a book, so it's not a video. We see them in our mind's eye, but there's some beautiful women in that office. And he's still a man. And he's still aware that he's being looked at as a man by these women. And he still wants to be respected. And it's impossible. he looks like a bag of bones, and he's filthy. And it's one of the most heartbreaking, there are much crueler things in the book, obviously, that happen to human beings in there. But his reflection on how these women were perfectly made up, coiffed, and dressed. Look at these German secretaries. Look at these Jewish chemists. Is so heartbreaking. And he doesn't tell us everything about what he feels in those scenes, but he doesn't have to. And I feel like they're so it's so hard. We look at it from the comfort of 2022. I guess we can sort of imagine what it would be like to be in Auschwitz, but not really. You can't. And
No.
I can't imagine what you went through in prison. Again, I can read about it. I can use my imagination. but I think there's a limit. We can't.
You did the episode with L.A. Paul, and she talks about a transformative experience, and
Right.
I think Auschwitz is, a quintessentially transformative experience, and part of what's revealing about that moment is that it's like, how do you respond to the absolute inability for you to be the person that you want to be in the world? And the thing about like being a survivor and being a witness, and I actually think that Primo Levi is a witness. I mean, I think every writer is a witness in some way, but the burden of it is that it's obligation to survive. And so what we don't know is how he processed the day to day to remember that scene. Like, he doesn't reveal that, but you know that it had to happen because there's two ways to respond to it. One way is to let it wash over you as if as if it didn't happen. To not even notice that you're no longer, to actually embrace being non-human, right? To embrace what people believe about you. That's one response, but it feels like his response was to take it all in and carry it around, and it becomes, it talks about people still bathing even with cold water and no soap, making their cheeks appear ruddy and healthier because it made you more likely to survive. And this is even if this is like a legal fiction, like if we went back in time, it might turn out that no, this is like the thing you said about correlation not leading to causation. But what he depicts is the sort of need to believe this, because it becomes one of the sort of building blocks that you use to believe that you're worthy of surviving. And what you don't get is what it meant to carry all of that horror around and then transform it into something that's beautiful. And one thing I think about prison, and when I'm reading it, you can't help but it. We like analogize. So I'm reading a book, and I can't help but to think about those the one moment where you get reminded of how you look in the world. And sometimes it's something as simple as, like, you go to the visiting room, or actually for me now, I got pictures on my desk, and people won't be able to see it, but this is me when I graduated from high school. I graduated from the Fairfax County Jail because it turns out I had enough credits to skip the 12th grade, and they gave me a cap and gown. And I look at the picture now, and I'm reminded of how wearing a robe wasn't a joyous occasion, because they literally couldn't find a robe that fit me, because like people my age weren't supposed to graduate from high school, and people my age weren't supposed to be in prison, so they just didn't have something that fit a kid that was 5'5" and 120 pounds. And it's that moment that smacked me in the face. And I'm smiling in the picture, because I'm smiling in the picture trying to think about the sort of resist. And I feel like it's not the equivalent of like bathing, even though you won't be clean, but it reminds me of the sort of, it makes me believe I could understand something of the desperation. And because I think I can understand something of it, it makes me admire the poetry in the lines even more than I would have, I think, if I hadn't experienced some of the stuff I've experienced.
And it's a deep question that maybe we'll be able to talk about it. I don't know if anybody can talk about it.
He said, this is what he said. This is what he said.
Primo Levi.
Primo Levi, yep. Imagine now a man who is deprived of everyone he loves, and at the same time of his house, his habits, his clothes, in short, of everything he possesses. He will be a hollow man, reduced to suffering and needs, forgetful of dignity and restraint. For he who loses all often easily loses himself. And I think the book, like, the ability to say that is the ability to acknowledge that being offended in that moment with those women is the insistence that I haven't lost all. I haven't lost the desire to be a man amongst women. I haven't lost the ability to recognize the shame that others should feel for condoning sort of this set of circumstances.
And you're reading that and you think, oh, because you're reading it in 2022, and I remember thinking, Oh, surely those women must have felt sorry for him, and they didn't feel sorry for him. They didn't see a human being, they saw an animal, and
Yeah.
that's the. I think it's true of. I have no. I feel like it's funny. I have no right to talk about it, but I'd like, if you want to talk, hear from you a little bit about the Black experience that Ellison's channeling. I mean, the book is so freaking timely. It's so sad how timely it is. There's an Eric Garner moment in the book where a man is simply selling something on the street that's not technically legal,
Yeah.
and gets shot down in cold blood by a policeman. Garner got strangled, suffocated. He did something wrong, but he did something wrong. Didn't deserve death.
You know,
And there's
what's profound about that part is like this. So this guy he was a part of the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood is an organization that the unnamed narrator joins when he moves to New York. But it's this interesting tension and the Brotherhood sort of believed superficially that ideas of race shouldn't be brought up. And they had Black and white members, and they would really consistently ask the Black members to sort of tamper down their notions of like racism, and think about this as basically it's a loosely veiled reference to the Communist Party.
Yeah, it's a utopian ideal that's loosely based on communism, but not on so much on the economics part, more on the revolution and resistance to the current inequities and injustices.
And what's profound about it is, so this guy was the guy who gets murdered by the police. I keep wanting to call him Clifton, but I'm not sure.
That's his last name.
Yeah, so Clifton is So I think to understand that moment, you got to back up 2 steps. And it was a moment when Clifton and Roz the Exhorter, they was fighting, and Roz the Exhorter represented, white people are evil and we should completely separate from white people. And he believed that Clifton and the unnamed narrator and any Black folks that were part of the Brotherhood were traitors. And so they were fighting in the street, and Roz got the upper hand on Clifton. And Clifton was a fighter and a big guy. Roz got the upper hand and started to stab him, and then started weeping and said, I won't do it. I'm not going to stab my brother. And he was like, why are you running with them? So you fast forward in a novel, and Clifton disappears, and the narrator finds him on the street selling these Sambo dolls. And then it's the altercation with the police, and Clifton is murdered by the police. But the narrator describes him as a man outside of history. And he was trying to, it's like what the narrator to me describes is like Clifton was struggling to grapple with the ideas that Roz was putting forth about the world, and the ideas that the Brotherhood was putting forth. And then the Brotherhood had kind of abandoned Harlem as a strategy, and it broke Clifton, and he became a man outside of history because he couldn't comprehend the world that he was living in. And when the officer murders him, what's interesting is I actually don't even think that officer operates as like a representative of the system. I think the officer operates as another entity that's living outside of history. And that's behaving in a way that's like unfathomable to anybody that's looking at it with clear eyes. And so when I read that part, I mean, I find it telling that we still deal with these stories.
Incredible.
But I find it telling that we still deal with these stories in a way that they kind of avoid, I think, Ellison's bigger point. And I think Ellison's bigger point was that, like, he saw Clifton and Clifton's struggles in a way that the people who were in, and that the way that the police didn't, the way that the Brotherhood didn't, the way that Roz didn't. Like, he wasn't a pawn for the narrator. He was a person who was suffering and who got abandoned and didn't know what to do with the world once that happened. And that's why I sort of found that part deeply moving. But I think Ellison is saying something so radically different about race in America than people first think. I was really like turned off by the True Blood scene at first, because I kept thinking that like he was creating these archetypes and that this is how he wanted people to read Black sharecroppers. and that he wanted us to juxtapose the black sharecropper with the college students, and then I realized that in the grotesqueness of that narrative, he was asserting the right for he said that he in a letter to Wright, he said that novelists, the fiction writers don't go far enough. They aren't ambitious enough even in their absurdities. And I think what he was trying to do with that is make a bigger point, and the challenge readers to see the bigger point. Because True Blood says, you know what's messed up? Is I do the worst thing a man could ever do. And that gets more support from white folks than I ever got in my life. I mean, if I had been supported in that way, we would have never been laying in the cold on the floor in the first place. And so I think to me, like, that scene is challenging. But then the other scenes that are challenging is how Ellison insists on noticing the people that we don't notice. And I think that's what Levy does too. Like, Ellison insists on, when he goes to New York, what is the first thing that makes him become an orator, a speaker? It's a couple being evicted. And his impulse to speak is both because he sees the couple being evicted as two elderly black folks being thrown out on the street, but also he wants to prevent the crowd from doing something that will lead to their death. You know, and who saves him when he leaves the sort of his first job, and you know, he's like, he got hurt on a job and they just left him out on the streets and he's stumbling through the streets. It's this woman, Mary, and he sees her and he describes her in such a way in which, like, she comes to life. I think that he animates these individuals, these Harlemites, these people in the community, even the vets, in a way that like demands that to be the center of how you think about Black life and how you think about American life. And maybe at least as much as many of the conflicts animate the novel. You know, many of the sort of tensions animate the novel, and the tensions that still exist. I would argue that Ellison probably would say the Clifton's murder wasn't the most significant thing about Clifton's life at all. You know, the most significant thing about Clifton's life was the way the people abandoned Harlem. And he was trying to fight for Harlem and fight for Harlem in a way that was actually trying to get justice for everybody. I think he would say the most significant thing was what happens when you abandon people.
Well, the humanity of those characters, like you say, I think in both books is, I mean, it's a great lesson for life in general. The idea that, look around you. There's so many people that people don't pay any attention to. And we talk a lot in this program about the Adam Smith line that man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. There's so many unloved people. And again, not just emotionally unloved, but they don't get respected, admired, praised. They're invisible. They're hidden. And we all can look around us and see those people. And I like to think maybe it's naive, maybe it's romantic, maybe it's an excuse. I like to think noticing matters and counts. I mean, there are things better than noticing, but noticing's pretty good. And saying hello to those folks in an honest way, not in a pro forma way, ask them how they're doing, paying any kind of attention to those people that are neglected, that don't fit in. I think it's a supremely good deed that we often fail to enact. It's uncomfortable, right? Those people are invisible. The tragedy, of course, is that they make themselves invisible after a while. They're so used to not being seen, they just kind of shrink into the woodwork, into the wallpaper, into the fabric of the world. And you feel funny sometimes reaching out to them because they don't make it easy for you. They're used to being unseen.
Yeah, I think the writer,
you have to do it.
Yeah, I think the writer. I mean, I think Primo Levi is like, you know, he tells these stories about others to make us see them in a way to push against that. When I read the piece about Lorenzo, and it was this guy that he met, and he says, he says, I believe that it was really due to Lorenzo that I am alive today. and not so much for his material aid as for his having constantly reminded me by his presence, by his natural, plain manner of being good, that there still existed a just world outside our own, something and someone still pure and whole, not corrupt, not savage, extraneous to hatred and terror, something difficult to define. But what was beautiful about it, right, is he says all of this, right? So he says all of this, and you're like, oh man, Lorenzo was great. And then he says somewhere else, he was like, and it's and then he says, where is it at? He says something else that was like, but you know, it's not even important about the details of the story. He says the story of my relationship with Lorenzo is both long and short, plain and enigmatic. It is the story of a time and condition now effaced from every present reality. And so I do not think it can be understood except in the manner in which we nowadays understand events of legends or the remotest history, which I thought was hilarious in a way, because it was like, this is it was these moments that honestly, I thought nobody benefits from Auschwitz, right? But I thought that it was this like intense moment that let you see something about humanity that you couldn't otherwise see. And in a short relationship, you could like say something profound. But the beauty of those lines was that in that short relationship, he could both say something profound and concede that, yeah, there was nothing special about the relationship. It's kind of like the stuff of legends. It wasn't a deep love. And that is so much of what prison is, because, because it was these relationships, what happens in it's like a relationship in dog years, what happens in 6 months feels like a decade. And to be aware of that and not romanticize, to admit that to the reader is I think, it's such a, and you talk about it as what it means about humanity in the world, but just as what it means just as a writer, I just found it really, really beautiful to be able to convey that. And I thought it was an act of making visible what could easily be, reduced to. It's a truly tragic book, but when I think about it, I think about hope and beauty and poetry. And I don't think it was sentimental. I don't think that it was meant to, I just think it was what do we demand of the world that we live in? And I think we have a choice. It's to be lovely. Is that what we demand of the world, that we want to aspire to? And I think it's so easy to just say, no, I want to write about how horrific man is and act as if that is the height of intelligence. And that I truly discovered something by revealing how horrible man is. And Ellison could have did the same thing, but they both resisted that temptation, even True Blood, he says, they say, my women, my daughter and my wife, and he's impregnated them both. And maybe he didn't, but no, I think he did, because his face was sliced open. So I think Ellison made clear that he did, right? And he's like, the wife was like, you should just leave. He was like, but a man doesn't leave, which isn't to make everything that happened before that okay. It's like to say that,
Not at all.
It's like, but I can only do what I'm supposed to do now, which I don't know how we respond to that, but I feel like when he wrote it that way, he too was trying to not make it seem like it was better, not make it seem like it was a good deed. It was still clearly, it made both characters, it made the unnamed narrator and the guy he was driving around sick. But I think it was still him saying that, I represent people in prison who've done horrible things. And I felt like you read that passage, and one of the things you walk away with is Ellison suggesting that after the worst, you can maybe never redeem yourself, but reach towards what you imagine is redemption, which I think is it's a hard thing to talk about,
Well, I as I get older, I think about that question a lot, of redemption. When I was younger, I judged a lot of people. As you get older, I think you judge people less. You understand how complicated it is to be a human being. It's ironic because now we're talking about people who do horrifying things. and yet they're human beings too. But as an artist, as a novelist in Ellison's case, or a memoirist in the case of Primo Levi, they're capturing human beings in their fullness. And they're not stereotyped. They're not cardboard. That True Blood scene is a masterpiece. It's a number. There are many, I would call them set pieces where Ellison just, the poetic flights that he goes on, the use of language, the imagery that he's able to invoke is so rich. And in this case, it's serving the humanity of this man who's done something wicked that he's aware of. He has sort of an excuse, kind of. He was just half asleep, he wasn't sure what was happening, maybe. But he's a human being. So now what? What now? And he's struggling with that. And he's not proud of what he did. He's ashamed of it, but can't erase it. And, we've talked on this program a little bit about forgiveness and, the challenge of forgiving oneself. And this character doesn't forgive himself.
No.
He's going forward. And it's part of him, what he's done. He knows that. But he moves on.
But
not fooling himself, not lying to himself, not deceiving himself. He struggles and goes forward.
And a subtle critique is of the way society treated him. They're all pawns in a way. The school wants them gone and doesn't care about the daughter and the mother and the other children. In a white society, it's never clear why they provide support. But even the guy, I forget his name, but even the trustee that hears the story and gets sick, Norton, he gives him $100. It's like that it's just like this idea. But at the beginning, so that was deeply like both troubling. But I think that Ellison was being crafty in a way because he was embedding the social critique in a story that was so engrossing that it's easy to not grapple with the complicated moral questions that are being raised. The same is true. Like it's this question is, when did he realize he was invisible? He says it in the beginning, but the beginning is the end, right? So he says it in the beginning, but that's not when he realized he was invisible. He realized he was invisible when he realized that Black people also didn't see him. When he dressed up as Reinhardt, he didn't even know who Reinhardt was. Yeah, and he puts on his hat and the glasses, and everybody mistakes him for Reinhardt. Then all of a sudden, he as a character has a moral dilemma that didn't exist. It was these slight notes of a moral dilemma when he was with Sybil. That was a sort of moral dilemma. How do you respond? But that happened afterwards anyway. That happened after the Reinhardt piece. But he put the hat on and the glasses, and everybody mistakes him for this black man named Reinhardt, who apparently is a trickster. He's both a well-respected pastor, but he's also a pimp, and he's a womanizer, and he's dangerous. and like all of a sudden he's like, wait a minute, if like you refuse to see me, like everybody refuses to see me. And I think that was also just the thing that made that I don't want to say it's the thing that elevated the book, but it's the thing that I've never heard about the book, that people like said, wait a minute, the narrator recognized that he was invisible. He recognized that nobody saw him when he started to notice that the Black people around him didn't see him. Like if it was that easy for him to become somebody else, they never knew who he was in the first place. If it was that easy for him to just change his name and leave it behind, like then maybe he never had a name. And that's the part that when I read this time, one, I recognized the moral dilemma that then that narrator was in, because he was like, okay, now this is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna destroy the Brotherhood from the inside. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. He couldn't bring himself to take advantage. And said, well, mind you, he had already had an affair with a white woman early on, so it wasn't sex. It was that the first relationship was clearly consensual, and it was based on a kind of mutual attraction. And and he left that bewildered and kind of ashamed when the woman's husband comes home and he believes sees him in the bed with her. With Sybil, he sets her up. He has the whole plan, and then and it's really and you talk about the '60s, and she wants him to brutalize her, to act out some sexual fantasy. This is like a really charged scene, and especially when you couple it with the fact that he is thinking that he'll go along with it for his own nefarious purposes, and then he's like, I can't do this. No, I'm not going to do this. So it's an interesting book in the way that it sort of unravels and reveals itself and forces you to question. I read it a time and a half this time. I read the whole thing and then I read 50% of it again and I jumped around back and forth. And at first I didn't know what was going on. Well, I knew what I thought was going on, but then I had to go back and I had to go back and spend some time with it to be like, am I responding too harshly? And when I went back and spent some time with it, I realized that it was sort of moral dilemmas that were revealing themselves in a way that was far more complicated than I wanted to give any book credit for in the front end. Because how can a book, because, he doesn't end underground. He ends like, I got to go back, I got to go back out in the world. It's almost like truce. The truce is next. How do you go home after all of this knowledge? But we don't get it from him.
So what you're saying reminds me of, I hadn't thought about it, but the first part of the book is just so unrelentingly depressing. In Invisible Man, everything goes wrong for this kid, and it's horrible, and he's abused in all kinds of ways, treated unfairly by blacks, by whites, and he finally gets what seems to be a good piece of good luck. The Brotherhood singles him out. Brother Jack sees him and goes, "Oh, you've got potential." And I don't know about you, Dwayne, but reading it, I'm thinking, and I'm not a communist.
Yeah, I know.
Doesn't matter. I'm so happy for the narrator that someone has seen him, sees the potential, sees his a role for him, and the narrator, of course. By the way, up until then, and it permeates the whole book. We haven't talked about this. He's constantly unaware of how to interact with people. He can't trust them. He doesn't quite understand them. He's always in the dark, and it's heartbreaking, right? We're rooting for him most of the time, and he's clueless, right? And what's brilliant about Ellison is that we can see who's trustable and who isn't. We can see it, but the narrator is always lost, especially when it comes to New York. He's this kid from Alabama, and he's in New York. Of course, this is a challenge for anybody of any race, but especially for this poor black kid from Alabama who's just been brutalized emotionally by people he used to respect and trust. And he doesn't know who to turn to. And so finally, there's somebody who sees him as a great, as a person of potential, someone who can grow, someone who could achieve something, and you get excited for him. And of course, deep down, I guess in the back of my mind, I probably would have told you I don't think it's going to turn out well, but I didn't want anyone to think about it. I'm rooting for him so hard, and of course, Jack's a horrible person. He's an objectifier. He sees the narrator as an object to be used rather than a human being to be treated as a human being. And it's the treatment of the inhumanity all around him is universal. But the race part, it's ironic. I think it's true of Levi also. Be curious your reaction. It's very particular, right? Primo Levi is a Jew, and the Nazis wanted to kill every Jew. And the narrator of Invisible Man is a black man. It could have been a story about a poor white kid who tried to go to New York. He'd have a lot of unpleasant experiences also. You could write it that way. But his blackness, especially the tension between the social activism of of Russ, the exhorter, who is a black nationalist, and the Brotherhood, which is this idea of universal colorblind justice, makes it so much more powerful. And even though I can't fully relate to it, the book makes me try.
But and it's also what he wanted, though, because what he wanted. So what he wanted from Roz, the unnamed narrator, what he wanted from Roz and what he wanted from the Brotherhood was really the same thing. Remember at the end when the riot is going on, and you know, you saw some of the profound ways that race operated throughout the book. Whether it was when he was working at the factory, and he said, "How do you make the perfect white paint? 3 drops of black." It was like, you know, it was a lot of like these
That's
subtle.
an inside joke. Yeah.
And so like you saw this tension that was rooted in race, and it was so rooted in race that the internal racial conflicts became absurd to the narrator. But for us reading it, it was very real. It was like the person who was used to break the union foreman, you know, or it was the Brotherhood using Clifton and using a narrator to break the power and influence of Roz the Exhorter. But what the narrator wanted was something different. Like he wanted to recognize the really particular problems of Harlem and address them and confront them along racial lines, not to pretend like the racial lines didn't exist, but to confront them along racial lines, but imagining that there was some unified way to do so, that you didn't have to be a nationalist organization to care about issues amongst Black folks. And he would tell Jack, but we can't abandon them. We can't leave them. And like, interestingly enough, when he went uptown and he was working on the women's issues, you know, he did the same thing. And so I feel like what Ellison wanted, what I walk away believing, and is that the hope in it is that the narrator believed that it was something possible in terms of justice that you could get without colorblind notions of how injustice operate. And so that's the, you know, the thread, and I think that's the thread that remained even at the end when it was the riot going on. And at first he was in it. He was like, this is a riot for Clifton. And then he realized it wasn't a riot for Clifton. It was a riot for the accumulation of indignities, right? But he also realized that the guy beside him had a gun with 1 bullet, that you're going to die. Like, you're outmanned here. This is not an effective way to try to create change. And that becomes the center of, you know, and I think Ellison is like, when Roz the Exhorter becomes Roz the Baraka, it is about the futility of certain kinds of nationalism and how you end up, you know, you could say it's like Frantz Fanon talking about how you become the oppressors, like how you end up eating yourself. And because, you know, Roz the Exhorter becomes Roz the Destroyer and is now suddenly willing to kill the unnamed narrator and is launching a spear at him. And I think that's, you know, so in terms of the contemporary moment and why Ellison is so, I think, relevant now, is because he's arguing that those tensions exist. It's how do you shape out how to reimagine America, how to reform America, how to make America better. The tension is still the tension between the, you know, Roz the Exhorter and Roz the Destroyer, and sort of the narrator, and how these different poles of belief operate in a world, and the tragedy of like, what would it mean if we stop believing that there's a possibility to come together and actually support this community having a better shake at it. So I don't know. I mean, I was troubled on the second reading of the book because I realized you don't think idea books should keep mattering. I mean, maybe we do think idea books should keep mattering, but I wanted to read it and believe that somehow we had lapped some of the questions that he raises, but we really haven't like lapped many of them. And I think some of us have become more ingrained in a sort of Roz the Destroyer side, you know. more entrenched in the Roz the Destroyer angle.
Yeah, well, there's always this temptation, I think. A related issue is when the narrator eulogizes Clifton. It's an incredible eulogy. And you want it to be this sort of emotional, I want it to be this uplifting tribute to this man. And it's not.
Mm-mm.
It's real. It's so real. It's so powerful about the loss of a life cut short and too soon. And it's a spectacular piece of writing to me, because it's not he could have written something really different. And he gets skewered by Brother Jack because he actually had a human moment. He just eulogized a man. And it really is ironic, given our pairing here. If this is a man, and that's what Clifton's, eulogy is, that this was a man. And the Brotherhood wants to treat him as a pawn and wants to treat the narrator as a pawn. And, I think our current moment of race in America is this tension between our ideologies, which we all have, whether we know them or not. Almost all of us have some kind of ideology, and the human moment. And if you're not careful, all you do is, I guess, the human moment, and you don't get any change. But if you're also not careful, you treat everybody like a pawn, and you're not a human being yourself anymore. I think I've talked about it before on this program. I know I have. I can't remember the episode. Maybe it'll come to me. But Vasily Grossman has a essay on Treblinka that is deeply chilling. Another death camp of the Nazis. And he actually argues that, the Nazis in those settings couldn't kill the prisoners. They could just kill themselves. They could murder their own humanity, but they couldn't take away the humanity of their victims. Again, a little bit romantic, perhaps, maybe sentimental, maybe unrealistic, but he says that in his other book, Everything Flows, which is another great book he wrote. Incredible book.
But do you think, and this is one of the, and I think this is one of the challenges for Levi. This is one of the challenges for anybody that writes about the Holocaust, is that it's very easy to just say that, like, the victims were pure, like the Jews were pure. It's like because the Nazis are so horrible that it's easy to just sort of frame the conversation that way. And I wonder, because when you think about criminals, nobody says that. If you're on death row for something, like, nobody says that. We have a horrendous system of incarceration. I'm not comparing, the Holocaust to prison, but I'm just thinking about people listening. People listening might be like, there he goes. But no, I'm just, because I often ask people, like, is the question not what does a person deserve, but like, what do we have the right to do to them? And I feel like that's what the narrator is constantly asking, and it's that moment where Roz is saying, you deserve to die. You were just trying to kill me. But what do I deserve to do to you as my brother? I don't deserve to kill you. Like, I refuse to do it. And then something transforms in him, and he becomes less than himself when now he's willing to kill the narrator. And I just wonder if how the beauty of, I think, of any, like, great piece of literature is that it refuses to make my right to live, my right to be loved, my right to be noticed a product of my purity. And I think that that's what Levi did, and that's what Ellison does. But, like, frequently in the popular conversation, our ideologies force us to assert the purity of our roles, of our positions, because it is that purity that justifies doing anything, rhetorically, or sometimes actually physically, to defeat the other side.
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that, Dwayne. I think that's exactly right, though. I think I think about, there's a concept in the Holocaust literature, and here in Israel, the righteous Gentile. And the Jewish community honors righteous Gentiles. They're very formal honorific. It means that during the Holocaust, you sheltered Jews or you took risks and saved Jewish lives. If you go to Yad Vashem, which is the museum here, the Holocaust Museum here in Israel, these people get named. There's an honor roll for these folks. And it's hard to think about whether the list is long or short. Like, would I have, if I were a non-Jew in Germany, Poland, Hungary, Italy, would I have sheltered a Jew, endangered my own family? I mean, how could anyone do that? Yet they did. And then you could ask, how could anyone not do it? But of course, most people can't. And there's so many, and you talked about the purity of the Jews, a huge issue in Jewish literature on the Holocaust of the Jews who collaborated with the Nazis in the camps.
Yeah.
Levy writes about it. Do you blame them? I can't. I don't know what I would have done under those circumstances. I have zero confidence in my own ability to rise above my urge to stay alive.
Levy certainly doesn't blame him. I mean, that was one of the things I found astonishing and sort of impressive in the way in which he paints some of those pictures. And it's not, like, again, it's not sentimental. It's just somebody who was there saying, sometimes I made some tough decisions too. And I think that really, like, great literature should move you to the point that, like, you are almost absent of response. And I do think and some of them take more thought to get you there. I think Levy's, like, it just cuts to the quick based on the subject matter, based on the writing. I mean, it really is just, like, so charged that you approach the page, and it's hard. And I've read other books that, I mean, we sent 1,500 copies of Frankel's book, Man's Search for Meaning. But even in the title, but even it's a good book. Some of it, the first half, I think, is lovely, right? And still, though, it's moments that like reach to, I think, the best moments of Levy, right? But as a whole, I stopped reading it. And it's not that I stopped reading it because I didn't think it was good anymore. I stopped reading it because it became, towards the second half of the book, it became just not the same thing. And so it's not that you guarantee to do the thing because you take on the subject matter. And I think this is what I mean. Like, the book moves you to a point where you see yourself you see something of who you aspire to be and something of who you aspire not to be within the pages. And I think that's when a book really, really does something for you. It becomes less about informing you and exposing you to a world that you hadn't seen, but it becomes about, in a really private way, bringing you into that world. And I think that's what Ellison does. And the beauty of it, the strength of it, the craft of it is when it tells that story about the man who was locked up for 19 years and he escaped, and he gives him that leg iron.
Oh, God. Incredible.
And then because he doesn't want to make it easy, he has another black man come into his office, like, "What's that you got on your desk? You shouldn't show people that. You shouldn't make people remember that." Yeah. And the narrator didn't want it, actually. He only took it because he thought he planned on throwing it away. And it was almost like Ellison showed us the narrator being educated in such a way that we became educated about what it means to sort of hold on to history. And all of a sudden, I didn't know who I was in that story. I didn't know if I was the person that wanted to hide my past. I didn't know if I was the person that escaped from prison, or if I was the person that just accepted something because I didn't know how to reject it. And I think that's what, but I was there. I was actually all of those three at various moments. And so it's, this is why, my wife told me I can't go back to college. But this is why, even in my moments of wanting to be an economist, of wanting to sort of, like, deeply understand markets, and ask myself, can you be an economist and think about the world without being so entrenched in numbers? The reason why I often find myself not wanting to be whatever we imagine to be a scientist is because science is obsessed with the resolute and
Yeah.
the provable, and art is obsessed with the notion that, like, if you weep, that's the only evidence that matters. If you move, that's the evidence that matters. And it's a weird tension in my own head about um, how to make those things coexist, because you know, you can become a person that doesn't truly try to find ways to fix problems because you only know how to talk about them movingly, if you don't think in some concrete ways. But the narrator was doing both. He was giving the speech for Clifton and also organizing. And so I think in that way, the narrator was believing that you could do both, and you could do both premised on the idea that that notion of universalism can exist without ignoring the fissures of race and without ignoring the realities of race, which I think is something that's deeply important for me to believe as a increasingly, like, I mean, I'm like 41 with children, it's something really different to be 20 and not feel like you got a stake and responsibility in your community. But now I feel like I should be doing, like, at the very least, I mean, I do vote, but it's like at this moment, you feel like at the very least, if you see somebody being evicted, you shouldn't just walk past them on the street and not notice that this is a whole life that's strewn on the sidewalk. And that's Invisible Man making me think that. And so I don't know.
Well, you're not alone. There's at least one economist who has that tension between the resolved and the ambiguity. I think it's something I think about all the time, right? A lot of people, especially being the president of a college that's devoted to the great ideas of Western Jewish thought. I mean, come on, you got science, or what about biology, computer science, engineering? Let's do stuff. All that art, literature, and philosophy do is make you weep. But I think they also make you wise, if you're lucky, and if the art's good. And I think that three-headed moment you had, three-hearted, I guess a better phrase, of feeling like the person who wants to hide his past, the person who wants to remember the past, the person who wants to emotionally cope with it and try to make it part of who that the person is. I mean, all of that should be who you are as a full human being. You don't want to be a cardboard character. It's a huge issue here in Israel about the Holocaust. It has been for since the establishment of the state in 1948, right? Here you have these Holocaust victims who are small and ineffectual. It's one way to summarize them. They are victims. And then the state of Israel gets established, and the ethos that Israelis want to have is we're warriors. We're not like those European Jews who sat around reading the great books for hours a day, and we're strong. We're not afraid of anybody. We got nothing to worry about except defending ourselves. And it's a fascinating, I think, moment in human history, that transformation of the Jewish people from this intellectual, ineffectual victim class. It can't be much worse than 6 million people dead in the Holocaust, to one of the greatest military absurd overcoming of odds in both the establishment of the state in 1948 and the War of Independence, or the Six-Day War in 1967. And so Israelis, I think, have an issue with the Holocaust. It's hard. And a lot of people, I was at a gathering the other night, said, this is a big issue in Judaism, is Holocaust enough. We got to look forward. We can't look back. Can't look at that past. If that's all we are as victims, then young people are going to get a terrible image of what Judaism is about. And I certainly think I'm somewhat sympathetic that I hate the let's compete and see who's the worst victim. Let's try to, I got I got mine, you got yours. Let's see who's worse. And I think that's a horrible mistake. But coping with the past, either the past of one's people or the past of one's own life, and how you should look back and deal with that or ignore it, is, I think, an enormously important part of the human experience. And it's not just about weeping. It's about knowing who you are, and certainly who you are is partly where you came from, and it's where you want to go. That's one of our great gifts as human beings. We can look to the future, and I don't think you can ignore it. And I think the richness, the non-resolute, the non-resolved aspect of the human experience is enormously important. And I think it gets neglected by an overemphasis on science and precise results and 3 decimal places. I love this line from Picasso. I don't like, he said, computers are useless. All they give you is answers.
Mm. You know, when you asked me for a book, though, that was my tension. It was sort of that like, enough about the Holocaust. I thought, like, what book will I choose? And I was thinking about Wright because I was reading it in the moment. And
Richard Wright.
Richard Wright's Black Boy. And I chose, I was like, I don't want to do this one because I thought that that he had a really clear sense of the world. But it was 1930s, Mississippi. But I thought he wasn't as generous to the people around him. And I just thought it wasn't a good thing to read in company with. I didn't want to read it in company with if this were a man. If this is a man. And so and then I thought, man, but am I going to choose a book that talks about race? Because, like, is this the only thing that we could talk about to understand what it means to be Black in America? And then I started thinking about the Freedom Library and the idea that arguing that Invisible Man is important in the way that it treats issues of race as important is not suggesting that there aren't another 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 500 books that we could be reading. And I think it's the same thing for If This Is a Man. It's like, in my head, I wonder if I reduce what it means to be, if I reduce what it means to be Jewish to the Holocaust. And then I think, no, I mean, I don't. I read The Chosen. I read a few other books, and I connected with The Chosen. I mean, I literally, I when I got hit in the eye with a soccer ball, I just thought, oh man, I mean, this is just like that book I read. And it was my solace as I was being rushed to the emergency room in handcuffs because they thought that I had a detached retina. And so yes, I buy that point. And I also believe that part of the struggle, at least for me, is finding ways to sort of deeply tap into other cultures of the world. And you can never do that through a math problem that just gives you answers. You can never do that through science, but you can do that through literature. And maybe that's why I appreciate EconTalk, because it has this belief in books as literature. Even the books that are sort of deeply rooted in different ways and economics, they still come off the page and within the conversations as literature, because it's always like a story that is animating the numbers. It's not the numbers that animate the story, it's the stories that animate the numbers. So
let's close with this question, and then maybe at the end you can give us a little update on the Freedom Library. So one of the things that was special about reading this book, and I told you before we recorded, I'll share with the listeners now, I started the book and it's so depressing. The first couple hundred pages, I'm thinking just everything goes wrong for the narrator. It's unfair. It's literally unfair. It's like too much. And I'm thinking, why did I agree to read this? It's just depressing. I get it. And having said that, there, as we suggested, there's numerous set pieces in this first half of the quarter, 40% of the book that are unforgettable, magnificent, and at least unforgettable for me now that I've read it a week ago. And then I forgot about them when I read it when I was 20. But they're fabulous. And the book then just rises up. It just goes from being a picaresque novel of a pitiful, abused character where nothing goes right to an anthem about all the voices in America, all the tensions that we've been talking about between races, and whether what we should be striving for, what's the right way to get there from here. And I finished the book this morning. I take a bus to work sometimes. I sometimes walk. And for reasons that aren't worth going into, I got off the bus early and I was going to walk the last 15 minutes to work. I just stood there and read the last 15 pages on the sidewalk, standing on my phone. And it just filled me up. It was, it's really an incredible experience. But part of this fun's not the right word, part of the emotional kick of reading this book as a 67-year-old instead of a 20-year-old was reading it with you. So I had you over my shoulder. And of course, I have to wonder, how, I can't read this book the way you read it. And similarly, while you were reading Primo Levi, I'm sure you were wondering how I read If This Is a Man. I mean, I cried when I read the Primo Levi at the age of 65. I'd read it as a kid, and I cried. There's one line, I'm not going to say what it is, but there's a line in the truce of all, compared to, it's the two books you would have picked, usually If This Is a Man, but in the truce, there's a line that just broke my heart. And I don't know, is that because I'm Jewish? Is that because I'm a person? But I'm sure when you're reading those two books by Primo Levi, you're reading them a little bit with me over your shoulder. And so it made it much more special for me to read it alongside you. I didn't know you were going to go back and reread Invisible Man. That makes it even sweeter. But to read these three books together with our different backgrounds and our different emotional responses, because you're Black and I'm a Jew, but it doesn't matter. We're just two different people. Going to read them differently no matter what. But it just made it was exhilarating in many ways. So I'm grateful to you for it, and really appreciate that you agreed to talk about it on the air.
Yeah, I was when you suggested Primo Levi, the book is falling apart. It came to me, and it's one of those books that like you might get a bad copy to buy it because it's both of the books together, yeah. and it was falling apart. But it became a whole experience. The pages were falling apart, but the ideas were so cohesive that they was just sort of becoming a part of my life and a part of my conversation. And I'm telling people about Levi. I got this habit of telling people about things as if they hadn't read it before. And I got a bunch of Jewish friends, and I'm like, "Oh, you read Primo Levi?" And I got a bunch of friends who hadn't read it, and I'm talking about this is the book that'll make you think about like prison in a different way, which is not the thing that you expect somebody to say about Levi. But I thought that I was reading it with you over my shoulder, but also I was reading it with you telling me that it would help me understand something of the Jewish experience, and then astonished in the way in which it reminded me how literature helps you understand something about like your everyday active experience of trying to be a human being worthy of being loved in the world. And when you suggested that I suggest a book to you, one of the struggles was figuring out what book it was. And then I chose Invisible Man, and then I was afraid that it was like the cliched choice. And I knew I hadn't read it since I was like 16 or 17. And I actually didn't remember much of it also. And it's weird because it's the kind of book that matters when you read it and you talk about it. The narrator, I don't know if he changes much from the first page to the last page. I think the narrator starts out saying, "But why would I lie to Mr. Norton?" And I don't think it's like, why would I lie to this white man? I think it's like, you don't lie to people. And so he ends the book at that same sort of innocence. And so, it's horrific because at the first parts of the book, you think this would just be better for him if he distrusted everybody. And when he takes on the Reinhardt persona, he starts to think this would be better for everybody if I distrusted everybody and was just manipulative. And then he abandons that, and reading it the second time made me believe, that made me believe that about different manner of possibilities in the world. And also this is the wild riff though. It says, I'm invisible because you've refused to see me. And it's like you, and the you is me, and the you is you, and the you is the reader, right? And then it ends with, who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you. Yeah. Which is to say, I speak a kind of possibility for who we might be that is radically different from both like who we had been and who we had been at our worst. And so it was a real honor and a pleasure. And I will say, right, like, we talk about reading it together. When I was talking to these guys, I put the Freedom Libraries. One was in a segregated housing unit. And when I was, segregated housing unit, solitary confinement, when I was in solitary confinement, I was in there for like 5 different times. But each time it was because they said I did something. Whether or not I think it was worthy of being put in a hole or not, it was always because they said I did something. And so when the prison said, well, you put one in solitary, I thought, yeah. And I thought it was for people like me who had ostensibly done something to get put in a hole. And it ended up being for a group of guys who, were roughly in like protective custody. And I got a chance to talk to them. And one of the things they said was the reason why books matter, it's not just the reading, but because we can have conversations like this. And I think that that's what you could do around books. That you could do around stories, you could do around narratives that allow us to see each other in profoundly different ways. That just is the one technology that I think truly distinguishes us. At least I imagine distinguishes us from every other species. Is the one unique thing about being human is that we could tell each other stories, and those stories allow us to think differently about who we are and who we might be.
My guest today has been Dwayne Betts. Dwayne, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It was a pleasure, always a pleasure. I'm chasing Mike Munger though. I'm at 2. I'm going to get to 150, before 2027. So he better keep coming on the show. I'm coming for him.
Yeah, I got bad news for you. He's coming soon, but it's okay. I'll have you back. This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.